Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Why do we in Bangalore and in India in general continue to have powerless and ineffective city governments in 2020? This is a simple question, but one that sits atop of many other questions, each with fairly complex answers. Today, Mathew Idiculla sheds some light on the broad legal and constitutional basis for city governments in India and whether in the 2020s we should start afresh. Welcome to this episode of BIC Talks. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Mathew Idiculla is a research consultant at the Centre for Law and Policy Research in Bangalore. Mathew has worked extensively on law and policy issues underlying Bangalore's governance, including with the BBMP Restructuring Committee. Mathew, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thanks, Pavan. Thanks for having me, and thank you, BIC.
My pleasure entirely. And Mathew, I want to start by asking you a fairly simple question. When we talk about municipalities and our city governments, we call them local self-government. It's not like we call the Karnataka state self-government, right? It's just the Karnataka state government. Is this an Indianism or is there something else to it?
Yes, the terminology of local self-government is quite interesting because you don't have similar prefixes for, say, the national or the state government. But I wouldn't say it is necessarily an Indianism. It may be actually characterized as a Britishism that has outlived British rule in India. And in some ways, it still continues in India and it continues in other parts of the world to some extent, but definitely not to the extent that's there in India. Let's look at the idea of what this prefix means. So if you look at the historic basis of local self-government, it seems to indicate that local governments are organized and conducted in an independent manner, that they are self-governing communities before modern nation states were formed. So in some ways, what it implies is this idea of self-government, which indicate autonomy. Self-government as opposed to modern nation state, which has a system of rule, which completely dictate the kind of governance system that exists in the city. So in some ways, it is a indication of the autonomy that exists for local government.
But in that sense, Mathew, isn't it almost doublespeak? Because if we think about self-governance, the local governments actually have the least amount of self-governance. Whereas you look at in many states and many countries across the world, your provincial governments and your national governments are fairly defined and often strong powers, and the balance might vary country to country. But they have a lot of powers that they can exercise immense authority over. And cities seem to have the least amount of this. So this feels wrong somehow.
No, so the idea is that you have self-governing communities. I mean, that's the basis of it, as opposed to a government. So if you look at historically, and that is the way also the British classified it, even when the British came to establish in some ways a strong state system, they were like, India has this long history of self-governing villages, and we will not directly interfere with that. We will just collect tax from that system. So it is an acknowledgement of those pre-existing self-governing institutions and the idea that it is a self-governing communities. And that's the basis of the idea, but it's gone further now. And if you look at it, the idea of self-government is not just restricted to local government. Self-government or self-rule can be seen, even in the historic European context. Church self-governance, right? So the church used to have its own systems of rules and procedures, which should not be interfered by the state. And just to indicate the pure non-Indianness of this idea, in the European context, in 1985, they came up with this charter called the European Charter of Local Self-Governance, which laid down the basic ideas of how local authorities should function in the European Union context. And they say that, I'm just quoting here, local self-government denotes the right and ability of local authorities within the limits of the law to regulate and manage a substantial share of public affairs under their own responsibility and in the interest of the local population. So there are obviously some elements of autonomy and some elements of limits to what the local authority can do because of the limits of the law. The law and the state is seen as institutions coming from above, and local government is seen as institutions that are pre-existing in some ways that will not be interfered too much by this new modern nation state which is functioning under the constitution. So that's the basis of the idea. I'm actually not opposed to this term. I don't think it makes the local government look less powerful. What I actually strongly object to is the other term that the Indian government system seems to have completely dominated by. That is this animal called the ULB, the Urban Local Body. That term by itself emasculates what local government stands for. It deprives the local government of any authority or autonomy. It makes it sound like an administrative vessel of the state government and makes it a body and not a government. The idea of a body is something that you can dispense with, and there's no idea of a government there.
Absolutely. And you're right, that dissonance in the nomenclature and the problems there get reflected on the ground as well, as we all know, right? I mean, the BBMP is just one tiny part of what actually governs most of our daily lives in Bangalore. And this is Bruhat Bengaluru Mahanagara Palike. It's a metropolitan corporation. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine how less empowered smaller city councils and municipal authorities can be. So here, Matthew, so clearly both in India and in abroad, we know that some version of panchayats and local governments have existed for centuries, if not for millennia, right? But if we jump all the way now to the 20th century and perhaps the 21st century, where do city governments then stand in national constitutions across the world?
City governments or local government, broadly, globally, do not feature in most national constitutions. I mean, I've not done an analysis of all the 192 nations under the UN or anything like that. But if you look at it, local governments having its authority, it's not always derived from the constitution. So local governments usually derive their powers from higher levels of government. That is usually the state or provincial government in the federal countries and the national or union government in unitary state. This is especially true for early constitutions. So if you look at early constitutions, like the Constitution of the United States, which is 1787, or the constitutions of Canada, Australia, you actually notice that there is absolutely no mention of the term local government. It's not just that it doesn't powers of the local government or what it can or cannot do, even if there's not even one mention of the term in these older constitutions. The constitutional recognition of local government is more of a recent phenomenon, especially more of a post-World War phenomenon. Some of the constitutions of the European Union, member states of the European Union, have local government provisions. Some of the constitutions of Latin America actually have very clear provisions on local government. And South Africa is the other example of local government having a very clear mandate under the constitutional scheme.
And this is post-apartheid South Africa.
Yes, this is the post-apartheid Constitution of South Africa of 1996. It's a very interesting constitution. I mean, for any comparative constitutional law scholars or anyone interested in law and constitution and systems of governance, the South African constitution is a fascinating case to study, whether you're interested in local government or whether you're interested in relations between different races or questions of how do you achieve social justice after years of injustice. I mean, there are many good things about the South African Constitution to look at. One of them is that it provides for what can be called as a three-tier federal system. It recognizes three levels of government, federal, state, and local, but it doesn't create them as in the typical federalism theory as completely different and unique levels of government. It provides for, quote unquote, distinct but interdependent and interrelated system of three levels of government. Or actually, they call it the three spheres of government. That is the terminology that is used in the South African context. So especially in the present context where you have people from Prime Minister Modi to others speaking about cooperative federalism, the ideas of cooperative federalism are actually laid down with quite in detail in the South African constitution. And local government is essentially recognized as one of that sphere of government with its own set of functions that it has to perform. But it also allows a system where three levels of government cooperate with each other in performing these functions. So that the idea is to avoid clashes between the levels of government. And it's laid down in the constitution.
And this is baked into the constitution.
Yes, this is laid down in the constitution saying cooperative system. It clearly provides for it within the text of the constitution. And I can hardly think of other constitutions which do something like this.
Okay. And I still want to stick to the law and the constitution here before coming to sort of, actual powers and so on. So in countries like, say, the United States or even European nations, we still think of city governments as fairly functional, empowered beings. We know the names of the mayors of big cities like New York or London or LA. Has this all happened because state or provincial governments in those countries have taken proactive steps, created laws and established city government?
There are state constitutions because US is a very federal country with state constitutions. So some of the state constitutions actually provide for local government. And the US system, to quickly state, has two kinds of local government systems across states. You have what is known as home rule and what is known as Dillon rule. Now, the Dillon rule is the more prevalent system, comes out of some of the judgments of Justice John Dillon, who was a judge in the Iowa Supreme Court in the state of Iowa, who basically said that local governments are, quote unquote, creatures of the state. That means they do not have any independent power of themselves. They only exercise powers that are directly given or devolved to the local government. They do not have any inherent or independent power. This is the Dillon rule. And this Dillon rule was affirmed by the Supreme Court of the United States in Hunter versus City of Pittsburgh in 1907. That is more prevalent, but this Dillon rule has been seen as restricting the power of local government. So there's been a lot of objection to that. And many states have come out with what is known as home rule, which is in opposition to Dillon rule. Home rule provisions are usually made in the state constitutions, which actually give the local government much more power and much more autonomy than what the Dillon rule provides for. And what it provides for basically is that it's not just through a legislative action that local government is carrying out its function, but local governments are seen as having inherent power. The local government can perform actions which are not expressly given in any law by the state. And then those actions can be challenged in court and may be held to be unconstitutional, but it can still carry out functions which are not expressly given in the state law or state constitution or federal law or federal constitution.
So they can do things independently so long as their actions are constitutional. That's fascinating. And it's similar in Australia, right? Australia also has, I think, state level constitutions, which...
Yes, but Australia, Canada, these countries again don't have constitutional recognition in the federal constitution, but Australia has it in the state constitution. But powers actually are not as much as anything like the home rule. If you look at those state constitutions also, it's very enabling provision type. That's the same with Canada.
So now, Mathew, India obviously has had its own journey in all of this, right? I mean, it's this weird dichotomy where though so many of our national leaders in the independence movement started their political careers in city governments and in city councils, somehow not much of that gets reflected in our constituent assembly debates and our constitution. And city and local governments only get formal recognition in the 90s, right? So even though I think the first municipality in India, goes back to the 1600s, I think with Madras. So what I want to know is that after spending, 40, 50 years of independent India, we finally give city and local governments constitutional mandates and, we enshrine them within the constitution with the 73rd and the 74th Amendment. Is India unique in this almost violent distinction between what is laid down in the law and what is happening in practice and how much powers city actually have?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to examine, actually. And I actually think it's a classic comparative constitutional design or comparative political studies question to look at. If you look at the literature, there's not much which does a very good comparative analysis of this. Even the kind of writing and research I've done is that I'll do a bit of comparison, but I would mostly restrict myself to the Indian case, even in some of my writing. So the fascinating question which can be a PhD thesis, is whether constitutional entrenchment of local government power is a necessary or sufficient condition for local governments to exercise autonomy, right? And you can ask this question in multiple ways and carry out cross-country comparative studies to actually understand that. From whatever I've seen and read, I've not been able to come across any study which asks this, what I feel is a very important question. Because if you're a supporter of local government, what are the strategies and pathways that are needed to make local governments powerful? Should it always need a legal or constitutional entrenchment, or can it be done through the other ways? Anecdotally, if you look at it, it doesn't seem that local government entrenchment in the constitution is a necessary or sufficient condition for local governments to exercise autonomy. Just if you look at it, the US is a classic case where there's no constitutional entrenchment, but you see the mayors of the city really exercise a lot of power. And India is the sort of extreme where you have detailed provisions of local government being laid down in the constitution, but city government still exercising limited powers, mayors almost non-existent or unknown and functioning in that system. But these are, again, anecdotes. To make a causal claim, you need a much wider analysis. But I think this disjuncture between de jure local government powers and de facto local government powers is something that is a fascinating study and something that needs to be done.
So, Matthew, we are having this discussion, a full 28 years after the 74th Constitutional Amendment was enacted, right? And came into force. So, what are the big things that the amendment has now, therefore the Constitution has, that has still not seen much implementation anywhere in the country?
Some of the local people who are familiar with the urban governance debates might be more familiar with the key problems with which local governments function in India, especially the interference of the state government over the local government. So just taking a step back, in 1992, you had the 73rd and 74th Amendment that was passed, and it came in force a year after. What it provided for is that it mandated that each state is required to create urban and rural local governments in its territories. And it provided for creation of a set of institutions, and it also provided for devolution of a set of powers from the state government to the local government. Only certain provisions under the 74th Amendment are mandatory provisions. Other provisions may be seen as discretionary. So the major sort of crisis, of urban governance has been that despite the 73rd and 74th Amendment being passed, local governments continue to be governed by pre-73rd and 74th Amendment laws, because local governments existed before 73rd and 74th Amendment. 73rd and 74th only provided for some clarity and some mandates. What the states did to make their laws in compliance with the 74th Amendment is that they mostly tinkered with the laws by making some small amendments, providing for institutions like State Election Commission, making provisions for reservation of seats, making provisions for state finance commissions, and also sometimes providing for what is known as metropolitan planning committees and ward committees, in their laws. But if you look at how they have functioned, there have been a few studies that have been carried out. These laws have been, quote unquote, remained on paper. A study conducted, official review of the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission program, found out that only 8 states in India actually devolved all the 18 functions that were listed under the 12th schedule to the 74th Amendment to the local government. So the 12th schedule lists out 18 functions which the state is expected to devolve to the local government, but only 8 states in India had actually devolved all of those 18 functions to the local government. So states have failed in devolving powers. Other studies, Janagra's A6 report from 2017 looks at 23 major cities in India and looks at the de facto devolution, not what is there in the laws. And they found out that on an average, if you take all the states together, all the cities together, at least the cities that they have analyzed, only 9 out of those 18 functions have been effectively devolved. The others have been just devolved, on paper.
So the biggest things, like for example in Bangalore, we keep talking about planning, and that still remains firmly outside of the ambit of our elected local government, right? I mean, that you have the Bangalore Development Authority, which is basically an agent of the state government, which is coming up with these master plans. And unfortunately, beyond the master plans, we don't even have other plans which are meant for development and prosperity of the city.
Yes, absolutely. So if you look at the 18 functions listed under the 12th schedule, which are supposed to be local government functions, the first 3 functions are planning functions: urban planning, regulation of land use, planning for social economic development. These are the functions which are supposed to be done by the city government or the local government or ULB, whatever you want to call it. But if you look at it, that is precisely those functions that are not carried out by local governments across India, right? There are some exceptions with different, states like Gujarat and Kerala, which are otherwise, sort of used in opposition to each other, Gujarat model and Kerala model. Both of them have some, provisions, and to some, actually even Maharashtra, having laws which provide for planning with the local government. But those are mostly exceptions. So the point is that planning powers have still remained with development authority. So this is the other part of it. 73rd and 74th Amendment created these institutional mechanisms, but not just pre-74th Amendment laws, but pre-74th Amendment institutions, state-level authorities that were created mostly in the 60s and 70s. These have continued to operate with hardly any changes to its structure. These are commonly called as parastatal agencies. Parastatal agencies of the state, which have some level of autonomy to function from the state, but its only level of accountability is to the state. These may be in the form of authorities like your development authorities, or it can be in the form of service delivery public corporations, right? Which deliver water, electricity, transport. So these are parastatal agencies which actually carry out many of the functions which are quintessential municipal or civic functions, which were instituted during that 70s phase, when many of these institutions were created. If you look at it, interestingly, many of these institutions were created during the years of the emergency, when the state sort of decided to sort of professionalize and, and it was so the BDA, all these institutions, and the DDA, and so many of them, the DDA especially, right? The DDA came in that context of, land acquisition and demolition of, houses during that emergency, all of that. So that is the conflicted legacy.
The non-democratic history of these institutions. So it's like almost a birth defect to many of these, isn't it?
Yes, and it has continued. The problem is that even after the 73rd and 74th, these institutions have continued and they function as, silos in many ways. And you have a bureaucratic head who is at the level of a senior IAS officer, often at the level of a additional chief secretary. So then that person becomes very protective of his staff, and he or she just, make sure that the powers that the institution had gathered over the years, they don't let it go. So that is the system that we exist in now. State continues to exercise powers both through parastatal agencies and also in other ways, what I've called political, administrative, and financial control. Political control through appointing of commissioners and making the mayor subservient to the commissioner. Administrative control also through having provisions which require the local government to always submit all kinds of, administrative reports to the state government, and the state government can come and directly take over the administrative local government if it wants under the laws. Financial control is the other big thing we have not talked about. For limited some transactions, even for taking loans, even for carrying out any project over a sum of amount as provided by the state, you need approvals from the state government, you need approvals from different authorities. So through parastatal agencies and through other means of administrative, political, and financial control, states have more or less not allowed local governments to function.
So along with this, Mathew, I want to talk to you about what were some of the defects in the law itself. And the reason I'm saying this is that often in popular discourse, the 74th Amendment is almost taken as gospel, right? As this, fantastic amendment which empowers city governments and panchayat. The 74th Amendment is often taken as gospel that empowers city governments. And the large narrative is that if only the 74th Amendment were implemented in spirit and in letter, then we would have functional city governments. And that sometimes I think, does not sufficiently look critically at what went wrong in the drafting of that amendment itself. So could you walk us through some of that?
I completely agree with you, Pavan. Yes, as I mentioned in the previous response, there is quote unquote some level of implementation failure. The states have not devolved powers that it is supposed to. State continues to exercise control in many ways. But sometimes it's important for us to look at what is the design that allowed for this implementation failure. Are there design flaws in the law or in the policy? In this case, the constitutional amendment, which actually had a role to play in the quote unquote implementation failure narrative that has come about. If you look at the 74th Amendment in detail, you would actually find that it is a fairly detailed provision in terms of its defect is in the fact that it doesn't say enough. Because if you look at other local government provisions, say in South Africa or Brazil, these are constitutions which have local government powers. They may not say a lot. I mean, in terms of the number of words, India has the longest constitution and everything we detail out. But the fact that you detail out something doesn't mean that it empowers you. And that is very much true of the 74th Amendment. So the 74th Amendment, if you look at it, does not provide local government independent powers or autonomous powers by itself. What it provides for is for the devolution of powers from the state to the local government. So what does that mean? One way to look at it is to look at the 7th schedule. Because the 7th schedule of the Constitution has nothing to do with the 74th Amendment. 7th schedule has 3 lists which lay down the powers of legislative powers of various arms of the government. It is union list, state list, and concurrent list. And you obviously don't have a local government list. And what the 74th in some ways provides for is that those powers that the state is given under the state list, you may devolve some of those powers to the local government. And there's a provision of the 12th schedule which lists out 18 of those functions.
And these are purely optional and discretionary and up to the states to do so.
Yes, the key provision of the 74th Amendment. So, because that is the only provision to actually look to understand local government power actually is Article 243W, which says that the state may. It doesn't say the state shall. Subject to the provisions of this Constitution, the legislature of the state may, by law, endow the municipalities with such powers and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as institutions of self-government. And then, it goes on and provides for, and mentions about this 12th schedule and, makes a connection there. So one is obviously this may provision. And this may provision keeps coming up with even in, some other aspects of the 74th Amendment. But it's not just a question of may or shall, because, some of the shall provisions are provisions of creating a metropolitan planning committee and provisions of creating ward committees. Those are shall provisions, but the implementation of that shall provision has also been obviously very weak.
So the metropolitan planning committee is something that ought to be done according to the Constitution.
According to the Constitution, any city which has a population of over 10 lakhs or 1 million, any area having that, you should constitute a metropolitan planning committee. Similarly for ward committees, these are shall provisions which haven't been enacted and enabled by the state. So I would say that shall question is important. It's an important defect, but that's just not it. I'm saying that you have to look at it in a broader way. That is, read the 74th Amendment, 12th schedule, etc., not in isolation, but along with other provisions of the Constitution. That is, provisions like the 7th schedule, which should give you an idea of what the local government where the local government lies in India's constitutional scheme. And my argument is that unlike what most people, who are praising the 74th Amendment and saying that 74th Amendment is not implemented, is that the 74th Amendment did not provide for what is classically called as a 3-tier federal system. That is, it's a truism that India transitioned from a 2-tier federal system to a 3-tier federal system with the enactment of the 73rd and 74th Amendment in 1992. From UPSC to everywhere you find these classic answers, which in my view is completely misguided and misinformed because it did not provide for clear institution of government. So just look at it. What is the nature of power that local government has? Does it have exclusive executive powers? Well, maybe in some areas, but in reality, not much.
And even your chief executive is an appointee of the state government, right?
Exactly. The chief executive it is either the commissioner or secretary or whatever name you call him is completely, the local government has no role to appoint that person. So administratively, executive power is vested with the state government appointee. So limited executive powers. Legislative powers, almost nothing. Local governments cannot make its own laws. It can make some what are called as bylaws that the municipal legislation of the state allows it. So it has some limited, it's not even limited. It's almost non-existent in practice. And obviously, you don't have anything like a court institution at the level of the local government. So no judicial power. And the other key aspect of the inherent weakness of the 74th Amendment is that even under its vision of may provisions that the state may endow to the local government, what are the functions that are listed? There are planning powers which have not been devolved. There are some levels, some kinds of functions which are related with sanitation and public health. And there's some mention of educational activities. But classic local government functions like urban transportation, right? Or even housing for urban poor, or like the council estates or the council flats of local government. They're called council flats, people who grew up in council flats. And I'm talking about the UK, right? Because the local council will build those accommodations. Is the BBMP building or any local government in India building houses for poor or lower middle class? No. It's all done either by state, or you'll have a Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, or even aspects of urban commons. You don't have explicit mentioning of lakes or any other forms of urban commons under the 12th schedule. So these are classic aspects by which the 74th Amendment by design doesn't allow. And just one more point about the main thing that we miss often in these debates is that the 74th Amendment does not provide the local government an autonomous domain of taxation. The 74th Amendment allows local government to levy taxes that the state legislature may allow the local government to levy. It does not vest it with specific independent domain or aspects of taxation that is exclusively with the local government.
And we see this having massive problems, right? Because if cities are considered engines of growth, you look at where taxes are collected in India, mostly it is large cities which are tax bases for the country, or the largest tax bases. You look at the split of erstwhile Andhra Pradesh into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the big fiscal tussle was over Hyderabad and all the tax revenue that Andhra Pradesh might lose out on because it loses its capital, right? While that is there, none of that taxation is directly linked to the local government in any way. Now, one way to do it is, as you say, give them explicit taxation powers. The other is to also give explicit automatic transfers that are unconditional, right? We have very good working finance commission system which does that between the union and state to address sort of fiscal imbalances there. But the state finance commissions are a joke, and therefore our city governments don't really have any money at their disposal that they can use to the ends that they see best.
Absolutely. And even with the GST coming in, it has further, weakened in some ways some of the powers that the local government would have had earlier. Whether they were exercised well or not is a secondary matter. In the Indian context, what has happened is that with liberalization and with opening up of the economy, the city growth story has happened in terms of high growth and some GDP growth and population growth, all of that, and investments coming in. But the route through which those investments come and the state authority that carries them out is the state government. So the entrepreneurial urbanism is not done at the level of the city, but it's done for the city. So the brand Bangalore International Summit, or all these kinds of global investors meet, all of these are done, to attract investment into the city, but it's carried out by the state government. So entrepreneurial urban reform is done by the state government. And in that way, the states have actually gotten more revenues and have gotten a bit empowered as opposed to the union, because earlier the 60s, 50s system was the union had more powers. But over the last 30 years, the states have actually gained much more powers, especially in this context of globalization. So the classic narrative that is used by scholars, which they speak about state rescaling and cities gaining power in this global neoliberal enterprise, that has happened in India at the level of the city, but at the level of government, it's at the state government for the city and not the city government making the city an entrepreneurial engine.
So given that this is the case, Mathew, in the 2020s, are we better off getting a new deal for our cities? Are we better off, potentially scrapping or reworking the 74th Amendment and figuring out a new arrangement? Like, for example, if state governments are not comfortable giving certain powers, why keep them on paper? Maybe have a new arrangement where, say, transport actually comes to the city, but maybe aspects of planning stay at a higher level. I mean, I'm just spitballing here, but do you think the time is right for us to start anew?
Saying things like scrapping the 74th Amendment would be seen as sacrilegious to all supporters and proponents of decentralization and local government, right, in India.
I agree. I mean, what I might say might be sacrilege, but...
No, but I think it's an important question that you ask. I think it's a fair question. It's not an unfair question. I think it's important to ask that. And these are questions that other fellow travelers who support local government will not ask, and they'll just say 74th is not implemented, 74th is not implemented. But I think it's an important question. But as they say, that phrase which I quite detest, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So as if, people who tend to babies, mothers and others, throw the babies out often. It doesn't happen, obviously. But what I'm saying is that it is definitely a time to look at urban governance anew and not be restricted by the imagination of the 74th Amendment. There are a couple of reasons for it. Because the 74th Amendment by itself will not be restriction, at least the way I see it. It's an enabling provision. It is not a limiting provision, largely. So if it's an enabling provision, you can try out things which are not expressly laid down in the 74th Amendment, but which you, meaning should be the state government, think is the right thing to do. So in that context, I think it's completely time to look at it in a new way. But at what level is that possible? Should we think about revisiting the 74th Amendment and coming up with a new enactment there at the level of the constitutions? Now, proposals for these have been made. Shashi Tharoor came out with a private member bill providing for amending the 74th Amendment of Part 9A of the Constitution and introducing new provisions which empower the city government. And most importantly, because Tharoor is most keen about that, is providing for direct election of mayor with 5 years was one of the key reforms there. That private member bill was introduced. Obviously, nothing has happened with it. But my sense is that route of going for another constitutional amendment, I'm quite skeptical of that move. What I say is that top-down decentralization measures have a propensity to fail if it is done without building support from other stakeholders, state governments, and local communities. Do people want this? So I'm a lawyer and I work obviously with the law and in the policy space. But over the years, I've realized that if you want lasting change, and it cannot be a pure legal or constitutional change that is imposed from above, you would actually need political change. You need a political decision to enact some changes. So the way I see it is you have a new deal for local government power, and my sense is that new deal should have enough local government champions from the political class, ideally at the state government level, and carried out in one state or for one city. Say Karnataka decides to do it and says that let's do it for Bangalore, and then other states or other cities might follow. But if it's purely done in a very technocratic, legal, constitutional way where you're just mandated to perform certain functions or mandated to make these changes, there isn't enough incentives for those systems to work.
And we might end up having this discussion 30 years later saying, was this new top-down amendment a success or not? And should we have another new deal? We don't want to end up there.
Absolutely. So in that way, the conversations we are having needs to go beyond the circles that we always have it in, right? And I believe that if you have, say, some important state level leaders from, say, the city who champion some reforms and who think that, wait, I'm an MLA now or an MP now, but I can do more for the city if I become a mayor, then he or she might push for that reform. But presently, under the present structure, obviously the MLA exercises more power in the city than the mayor or any person, right? The MLA is the most important person. So that is why he or she tends to remain in that post. But if you actually feel, if he or she also feels that, no, actually, I might be able to do better if I become a mayor and the mayor has some powers, then you would have pushes for that system to happen, right? So I believe if you want to make changes, that's the path to go. And then you can have a system. And what system it would take, I don't want to prejudge fully. I would say that broadly in terms of principles, I would say we should go by what I would call as a federalism plus framework, which is looking at federalism not in a very strict sense of center and state, but looking at federalism as a relationship between, maybe to some extent drawing from South Africa, right? As a relationship between different levels of government, not just 1 and 2. We now have a federalism which is classic 1-2 level federalism. Looking at federalism as a relationship between different levels of government, center, state, local, and even institutions below it, and have that federalism plus arrangement with the principle of subsidiarity. That is the idea that what can be done at the local level should be done at the local level, and only those functions which cannot be done at the local level should be taken up. I would say this is the broad policy frame, I would think, which I'm saying the 74th Amendment does not provide for this. My idea is that you have a proposal for such a framework, which is a federalism plus, which provides for subsidiarity and which provides for what I would call a multi-tier governance framework, which empowers not just the cities, but also units below it, which are ward, and also empowers people's participation. So at the lowest level, a Gram Sabha equivalent perhaps. So you have that idea, but it needs champions, and it needs champions beyond people like us or people who listen to this podcast, right? So, and how do we get into those debates, and how do you make that possible? And then those conditions of possibility should exist, and then such reforms, I believe, might be possible.
Mathew, thank you so much. I'm really hoping that in this coming decade, we'll at least start seeing experiments at this somewhere or the other in our country, and hopefully those experiments should prove successful and become a demonstration for others to follow, and hopefully we can escape our legacy from sort of independence and the birth of the Indian Constitution and the amendments from the 90s, and actually have empowered city governments which deliver for its citizens. Mathew, thank you so much for joining me on BIC Talk.
Thank you, Pavan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.